Good evening. My name is James Allsop. I'm the Chief Justice of the Federal Court, and I'd like to welcome you all to tonight's lecture. But first, may I acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. It's a great privilege and a delight for the court to host this lecture this evening. Originally the Tristan Jepson Memorial Foundation lecture, and now Minds Count 2018 lecture. As most, if not all, in this room would understand, there is strong evidence that the incidence of mental health issues is higher in the legal profession than in the general community, and in a number of other professions. And the Minds Count Foundation has played an instrumental role in its former name and its now name in pushing for the recognition and open discussion of this prevalence of mental health issues in the legal profession. It goes without saying that the Foundation's guidelines have been a critical step forward in this regard. And with 196 signatories, these guidelines provide workplaces with teams and a set of tools and resources to identify potential risk factors for the mental well-being of staff, focusing on the prevention of harm by targeting root causes of workplace stress and anxiety. In January coming, I propose to address a joint conference of state and federal court judges that's held every year on courts as institutions and workplaces. And I think it's important to recognise that we are workplaces not just for those who work in them as judges and staff, but people who work in them as the people as advocates and solicitors. We're very fortunate tonight to hear from two people who are eminent to speak in this regard, and I'll leave it to Melinda to introduce Melinda Upton to introduce our speakers. If I may conclude with a couple of remarks, further remarks that are not unrelated. And they're brief comments about values. I've had occasion in the last few years to say a few things about values in law, because law is actually conceived and derived from values. Those values are not only in formal law, they're concepts, but they're human concepts of fairness and equality, respect for the dignity and integrity of the individual, mercy and justice. These lie at the heart of every individual and at the heart of society as human values. They engage the whole brain and the whole human, an attitude so often lost by lawyers in their what might be thought to be their rule-making in the left hemisphere. They are just as important in everyday conduct, in workplaces as in formal law. And a shift in cultural approach and legal approach that draws in and embraces these values will find itself very much more open, not only to recognising risk factors for mental well-being, but also to address them. With those comments, it's my great pleasure to call on Melinda Upton from the Foundation to introduce the speakers.
Thank you, Chief Justice. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Federal Court and the first annual Minds Count lecture. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. I just described this as the first annual Minds Count lecture, but it is part of a lecture series that goes back over a decade to 2006. As the Tristan Jepson Memorial Foundation annual lecture, this annual event has included speakers such as the former head of the Australian military, General David Morrison, the former New South Wales opposition leader John Brogden, the first woman to be Queensland Attorney-General Michelle Lavache, and last year Magistrate David Hilton. In July this year, the TJMF became the Minds Count Foundation. Although this opens a new chapter for the organisation, its reason for being has not changed: to promote psychological workplace health and safety in the legal profession in Australia, to identify best practice in creating resilience within our profession, and to work to have them implemented by everyone from universities and clients to firms and governments. I would like to publicly acknowledge and thank George and Mari Jepson, and former chair, who I see in the third row there, Alan Cameron, and board members, for their substantial contribution to this cause for over more than a decade, and recognise that there is much work yet to do. To get to that work, I'd like to acknowledge and thank my fellow board members. First Acting Chair David Field, in addition to Cindy Penrose, Mary Deligio, Greg Demore, Thomas Gaffney, Thomas Spohr, and the Honourable Anna Katzman. As I reflect on the diversity of speakers we have had for this lecture over the year, it reinforces the great challenge ahead. From magistrates to law students, from big law to suburban practices, and from clients to government, we all have an incredibly important responsibility to work together to create a profession that fosters resilience and doesn't contribute to making people unwell. With that in mind, I'd like to introduce tonight's speakers, Dr. Brian Marien and my fellow DLA Piper partner, Mr. Peter Jones. Dr. Marien is the co-founder and director of the Positive Group, a company dedicated to delivering evidence-based techniques to improve the psychological well-being, resilience and performance of individuals and teams. Dr. Marien is a UK-based medical doctor and psychologist, and in addition to numerous academic papers, has authored a number of books, including The Mind, A User's Guide, and Biophysiosocial Medicine, an integrated approach to treating mental illness. Peter Jones is a DLA Piper intellectual property partner and heads the DLA Piper tech sector in Australia. Together they will outline some key points from the current research on behavioural psychology, and also include some personal reflections on managing a career in a high-performance culture. Having first heard Dr. Marien speak at the DLA Piper Global Partner Conference in Paris earlier this year, I'm very much looking forward to hearing both of them again. Please join me in welcoming Peter Jones to the stage.
Thank you, Mel. Good evening, all, and thank you, Chief Justice, for inviting us along to this fantastic chamber this evening. While I'm a lawyer, and indeed I used to be a litigator in New Zealand, this is the first time I've actually been in a court since a rather inauspicious occasion back in Christchurch in New Zealand, when I was defending an organisation that had been served with a contravention of the then Section 52, well, the equivalent of Section 52 of the Trade Practices Act, the old Section 52, misleading deceptive conduct relating to canned ham, of all things, and the issue of 95% and 90% fat-free claims. So it's nice to be back in a courtroom, and to be fair, in a much friendlier environment. There are a number of friendly faces around, so thank you all for coming. Brian will talk a lot about some of the behavioural and the psychological and the physiological, which is incredibly interesting, and I find it fascinating as someone who has had significant challenges with their own mental health. There are also a lot of statistics, both in Brian's presentation, but all statistics that you would have seen in the media. And I don't want to downplay the importance of statistics, because they're incredibly important in terms of opening up people's minds around the challenges that we face. However, the challenge with some statistics is that they convert people into abstractions. And so my role here is not necessarily, you'll be pleased to know, not to speak about behavioural psychology, because that's clearly way outside my eminent domain, and I'm a bit concerned when Mel read through the list of august speakers that have been before. Brian certainly meets that criteria. I'm not sure that I will, but I will do my best. So I'm here to try and provide, I guess, a vision of my own journey through anxiety and depression, and my recovery from anxiety and depression, touch wood. I want to look at a few crisis points, and I don't want to dwell on that too long, but it's important, I think, to realise that you can, at certain points in your career, face challenges, and they can be potentially destructive. I want to engage a little bit in terms of the why, or at least my understanding of why I may have been more predisposed to issues of anxiety and depression, which I think is quite interesting and may well resonate with a number of you here this evening. And I do want to finish, importantly, with a message of hope, or at least my view of why I'm hopeful for the future and certainly for the next generation coming through. So if I can take you back probably about half a dozen years, I was a partner at Gilbert and Tobin, married to a beautiful wife with a nice house in Bronte and twins. So if you take the twins out of the equation, I had what some would say is a perfect life. More about that later. I was busy on a particular piece of work, and there was a challenging situation where we had a conflict, or an alleged conflict, against our firm in terms of the work that we had been doing. And I was sort of stuck in the middle of this, and as one of the other partners said, you're sort of stuck between a rhinoceros on the one hand and an elephant of the other. And this agitated me no end in terms of trying to find ways of resolving this, what I thought was not an issue, but was obviously an issue for both organisations. And this went right up to the GC level, and indeed above the GC level in both organisations. So I felt personally exposed in terms of this issue. And Brian will talk a little about rumination and the challenges that presents, but I absolutely ruminated over this issue in terms of, well, what can I do better? Why is this happening? And then you increasingly tighten the circle of despair. I was at my desk on a Monday morning, I believe it was, at about 10 o'clock, and I was busy working on another matter unrelated to that, but the rumination kicks in, and the next thing I know, I'm sweating, my heart is racing, I'm struggling to focus, I don't know what's going on. I think I'll go for a little bit of a walk. I'll go for a wander around the block, surely that'll sort it out. Come back after the walk, nothing's really changed. In fact, that heart is racing even more. So at this point, I'm thinking something isn't quite right. And, heart attack is the obvious thing that leaps into my mind for reasons I'm not entirely sure why it was heart attack. But anyway, that was what I thought was happening. So I take myself up to the Sydney Hospital Emergency Department. They were very good in terms of putting all the cables and stickers and things on you that they have to do and taking blood. Turns out it wasn't a heart attack. They thought it was probably a panic attack. So that was kind of a bit of a wake-up call then and there, and I thought, okay, well, I should probably do something about this, and my wife had been suggesting for some time, perhaps it's time to engage with someone to help you through this particular crisis that you're facing. I did engage, and I sort of was working with a particular psychologist at that particular point in time, but to be fair, like many males, I suspect I wasn't necessarily listening. I was attending but not listening. I certainly wasn't embedding some of the suggestions that were being made to me. My own personal nadir at that point came on a Queen's birthday weekend it was, when my family had gone off to Dubbo to spend the night at the zoo there. I couldn't face the drive. I simply couldn't face sitting in a car for that length of time. So I was at home alone, which in retrospect was not the safest and best idea I've ever had in my life. But as a sign of sort of how skewed your thinking was, I thought that was the best place to be. So here I am on a Saturday afternoon, and I cannot sit still. I can't watch television, I can't read a book, I can't listen to the radio. I go for walks, massive walks for like 5 kilometres, nothing is happening. I'm feeling awful. This surge of fear of everything and a fear of nothing. I called my wife, I can't get through to her, so I'm sort of thinking here, I need to do something. So what do you do? Well, at that point I thought I need to go and see a doctor. So I take myself off to a medical clinic at Bondi Junction, sit for about 2 hours in a waiting room, waiting to find a doctor. No disrespect to people who work in a clinic, but let's face it, it is a bit production line in terms of assistance. Fair to say I didn't get a lot of closure out of that particular appointment, and on the way back from the clinic, many of you will know Sidimefeld Drive if you go to Bondi. There's a footbridge that goes across Sidimefeld Drive, across that multiple lane highway, and I was about halfway across that bridge, and I suddenly have I stop and I freeze. And I have this incredible energy surge that comes seemingly from my feet right through my body. And I can still sort of almost remember that now. And I was sitting on the edge of on this bridge and thinking, oh my God, what is going on? I managed to get off the bridge, and you can probably tell from my voice actually, it's sort of getting a bit dry, because there's a bit of adrenaline that's happening now as I remember what that feeling was like. After that, I spoke to the psychologist who said, in her view, it was something that she calls magical thinking. It was not that I was going to jump, and not that I was suicidal, but my brain had effectively convinced my body that I had jumped off that bridge, and what I was feeling was the adrenaline that would have occurred if I had jumped, which didn't make me feel that much better, but at least I sort of understood what was going on. So at that point I was thinking, okay, so something needs to change. So at that point I thought I did start to engage more readily with a different psychologist with whom I had, I think, a stronger personal connection. But again, like many males, I got to a point and think, oh, I'm cured now, I'm fine. I don't need to worry about this. You get better and you move on. I don't need to continue to think about my mindfulness and being careful about my sleep and my diet and my exercise. So fast forward a couple of years and I'm at now DLA Piper and there is a family issue back in New Zealand involving my father, which I won't go into in terms of the details, but suffice it to say it's one of those events in your life that basically cuts you to the core in terms of your ethical and moral compass, and it basically affected me no end. So I'm sort of in this internal crisis with my family back in New Zealand. There are some issues at work that, again, won't go into, but let's just say there was a lot going on at that particular point in time, and I was not handling that at all well. I was incredibly lucky because I was probably on a path to basically getting sacked, I think, in terms of just being a complete dick around the office. But Mel Upton sort of sat me down and said, look, I think you need to take some time out. And that was interesting because it's the one thing that I could never do for myself. Have never been able to, I can now, have never been able to actually give myself permission to take time away, which is kind of really ridiculous when you think about it, but that was kind of my mindset. So it needed someone else to come in and say, Peter, you need to take time away. So it was interesting. So in that time away, I actually did. I thought, okay, this is it. I need to seriously consider. And I was lucky with DLA Piper provided assistance. I had my own psychologist as well. So I had the means to be able to, I guess, embrace a different way of thinking. And that wasn't a quick process. And indeed, it's still a work in progress at the moment. And it will always be, in some respects, a work in progress, but it is getting a lot easier. And it's getting a lot more mechanical in terms of the way in which I approach life, which is a great thing. So I'm sort of in this position now of getting back into work, and I figured, well, let me try and figure out what may have caused some of this. Excuse me, let's grab a different water. So over time, I sort of was working this up with my psychologist and sort of trying to figure out, well, what was it in my upbringing or my background that might have been the trigger points, or because I think you're always trying to find a reason. And I don't think there's necessarily one or any good reason, but when I was about 7 or 8, I had a bad bike accident. And I sort of was riding down a gravel road, sort of went, over the handlebars, smashed my teeth up, smashed the lips up, stitches in the face, and I spent about a week in hospital and I was unconscious for about half an hour. And that kind of, I guess, impacted me at that particular point in two ways. One, it became very risk averse around anything involving physical damage. So it probably accounts for why, Brian, before I'm not a very good rugby player because I'm probably a bit tackle shy. The other one, though, and this is probably the more important one, at that point, with the way I looked, I thought I was grotesque. I thought I was repulsive. I thought I was the elephant man. That was how I basically looked at myself. Not that necessarily anybody else did, but that's how I thought I looked. So you can imagine what that does to your own self-confidence and your own self-worth. I also am part of a family, and again, this is not a criticism of my mum and dad. I love them both, but they are very strong in their community spirit and civic duties. They are both members of churches. They work very hard in the community. And really, it was not necessarily an environment in which you were raised and encouraged to speak about how you were feeling, or to the extent you did, the response would typically be, oh, that's bad, but there are people who are far worse off than you. So again, you never really had the opportunity of exploring how you were feeling because it was always a relative issue. And there are always people worse off than me. So for me, I was kind of in this position of thinking that I had this sort of deformity almost, and I was not getting a lot of sort of support from my family at that particular point in time. So how do I then try and generate my own sense of self-worth? Well, like many people, I decide, well, the objective way is through your grades, through your schoolwork. So from that point on, I worked incredibly hard and it was basically, engaging with the teachers and learning and top of the class and all those wonderful things. In fact, one of the rites of passage that some of my girlfriends get put through, and again, I've said this at lunch and it sort of makes me sound like some sort of Lothario, I'm not. On the odd occasion I may have had a girlfriend, my brothers would put them through this process where they would sit down and make them watch it was a videotape then, but now DVD, of me in a New Zealand quiz show called W3. And this was a quiz show, you sort of go, general knowledge kind of quizzes. And I sort of, in that case, I got to the South Island final and lost to the eventual New Zealand champion, which, you'd think is not bad going. But my wife was watching this show and she said, geez, even back then you were like that. And I said, what do you mean by that? And she said, if you got an answer wrong, you could just see your internal brain punishing you. You could see it in the way you'd sort of go, or you could just see it wasn't about, there was nothing good about it. Even when you got a question right, it wasn't joy. It was almost like that was the baseline. Getting it right was the baseline. Anything bad, if you got it wrong, that was bad, that was terrible. So from a very young age, I'd basically developed this perfectionist, punitive approach to life. In some respects, being perfectionist around as a lawyer is not the worst thing in the world, but when you ally that with this punitive voice that's kicking you all the time and you're living your life like that, that is not particularly healthy for the length of time that I was living it. That was kind of, I guess, an aspect of it. The other one I think that's quite common for people that have suffered from depression and anxiety is the imposter syndrome, and Brian, I think, will definitely pick up on this. This is the one where you sort of say, I'm just lucky. I'm lucky to be here. It's not, it's not through my hard work. It's not through the sense that I'm a good person. I'm lucky, and eventually someone's going to find out. And all I'm doing is staying one step ahead of the people who are trying to find me out. And that's all I'm doing. So you're treading water, trying to stay away. It's sort of a bit like I was saying to Brian after lunch. There's an episode of The Simpsons where they were trying to make money and Marge said she was going to take up piano lessons. And I think Lisa said, but you don't play the piano. And then Marge Simpson says, yes, all I need to do is stay one lesson ahead of the students. And it's a bit like that when you have the imposter syndrome. All you're trying to do is just stay ahead of the pack that you believe is chasing you, even though there is no pack that's chasing you. And then the other challenge, of course, is that you just work harder. All my problems, I'd just work harder. So if there was an issue at home, I'd just go into the office and work. So it's a bit like Box the horse from Animal Farm. I worked harder. And fortunately, I'm not quite like Boxer, who dropped dead of exhaustion, but I must admit, at my worst, I was absolutely exhausted. I had no energy at all. So I certainly sympathise. So it's clearly not sustainable. What did I do to kind of get out of some of this? Well, obviously, great support from my immediate family here in Sydney and my family in New Zealand. Once I actually engaged them and told them how I was feeling in some of these challenges, which was, I think, quite confronting for Mum and Dad. And I was at pains to explain to them this wasn't me complaining or suggesting there was anything wrong. It was just the reality of, and when I have 3 brothers, so you've got 4 boys in a family, that's a lot to sort of deal with. So I'm not saying for one moment there was any criticism there. I had a great work family, people like Mel, and there's a lot of my colleagues here. Nick Boyle picked up a lot of my work when I took some time off, for whom I'm incredibly grateful for everyone who stepped up to help me get better. Diet, exercise, all of those things go hand in glove. The other thing for me is sleep. I know that if I have 3 nights of poor sleep, I'm far more likely to have some heightened level of anxiety than if I don't. So when I travel, and one of the tyrannies of the work that I do is unfortunately travelling a lot, I have to be quite careful about making sure that when I'm staying in hotels that are different from where I am, I'm trying to make sure I get at least 6 hours proper sleep a night, and doing all the things you should be doing in terms of whether it's magnesium and not drinking and all those things that are important and sometimes hard to do when you're travelling. For me, it's critically important. But I am, at the end of the day, positive and hopeful. And the reason, I guess, is that while this journey for me has been hellish, and for probably the people that I love, worse still, frankly. And in fact, I'm still surprised my wife hadn't divorced me for many reasons before now. But I'm positive. So before I went through this journey, I was one of the quintessential males, A-type kind of personality, stresses for other people. It's not me, it doesn't impact me, I'm fine, I'm impervious to it all. Now I know that that's utter rubbish. So it is about being empathetic. So I have incredible levels of empathy now, more so than I ever had, not just in terms of people suffering mental health, but for a whole range of things. I think the radar resets itself when you go through some of these things. The other one for me personally is my children. So I do see elements of some of the perfectionist behaviour in them, in the way in which they approach either their school or their sport. So the benefit is that I can engage with them in a way, and we've been pretty honest and open in terms of my own journey and issues with mental health with the kids. They know that Dad sometimes has anxiety and sometimes goes into bouts of depression, but he's certainly getting on the path of wellness. So We're pretty open about that, but it does mean that then you can engage with my son, who thinks he's going to be an awesome sports person, in ways of just trying to maybe dial that back a little bit, or my daughter, who sometimes gives herself a hard time about her clarinet, even though she was the only person to get an A+ in her exam, but she still thinks that's not good enough. So I can see straight away patterns of myself and them, and while the acorn hasn't fallen far from the oak, it's probably something that I can maybe try and avoid them going down some of the paths I did. The other reason is probably broader than that, and that is, not only is it conversations like this, and not only is it the work that Minds Count do, it's what I see just in everyday life. So, like many parents, you go through the process of finding schools for your children. We're in that process for secondary schools at the moment. I have been incredibly energised by the extent to which secondary schools in Sydney are embracing positive psychology, resilience, wellness training in all different ways, in many different guises. But ultimately, it's a conversation they have with their students. So I think that's incredibly positive. The way in which they work is often group-based. So again, you have these nice communities. And the final thing, just conscious of time, make sure, Brian, you have enough time. The other thing that I'd say is that there's a great saying in US politics, which is that you campaign in poetry and govern in prose. Another way of saying you have these rhetorical flourishes when you're out on the campaign trail, but really the rubber hits the road and things get quite dull and mechanical when you govern. There's a bit of that, I think, sometimes in the way in which we work, and increasingly the way in which we live. We live in a volatile, we live in an uncertain, we live in a complex, we live in an ambiguous world, and it's hard, and it's getting harder when you start to balance all of the things that you want to do, all the things that your kids want to do, and how do you lead a fulfilled life with all of these competing tensions. And part of it, frankly, is that we need to all try and generate more poetry in our lives, more emotion. Have fun when you can. When you're feeling bad, share that with others who are part of your support network. Again, if you look at it, and Brian will talk about this sort of fixed mindset, I was absolutely one of these people who have a fixed mindset. On a weekend, for example, I'd get up, I'd go for a run. Then I had to go and do the kids' beds in terms of the washing and setting and, sheets and stuff. Then I'd go out and do some lunch. Then I'd take Alex to soccer. If anything got in the way of that process, it was a problem for me. For example, if someone said, hey, why don't we go for a barbecue? It was the sense of, no, we can't because of. And it's like, looking back now, you see the folly of it. But at the time, that seemed eminently logical. For me now, it's sort of the benefit of being able to say, absolutely spend time with friends, because actually, and Brian will talk about this, it's community that makes a difference. That's the support network you need, and you just get I always find a tremendous boost in terms of the way I feel when you spend time talking with other people, and you're doing that in the moment. So you're not just doing it as window dressing, pretending to participate in a conversation, but you are actively participating in a conversation. I find that incredibly useful for me. So those are just, I guess, some very broad overviews of my own journey. I would say it is absolutely possible to be a lawyer and be a successful lawyer, even though you may have had mental health challenges, and I think it would be rare for people in the profession to not have had some challenges on the way. It is a difficult career, there's no doubt about that, but we can do a lot more, and as I said, I'm incredibly pleased that we're having these sorts of conversations. I wish I'd known what I know now when I was 26 as opposed to 46, but hey, you can't have everything. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Brian to engage some more in some of the science side of things. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. I mean, I've worked with Peter a couple of times now, and I think that he brings the poetry, so I'm going to bring the prose. I think listening to a story like that, it just brings it alive. That experiential process is really profound, because I think the human story, as the Chief Justice was saying, is that actually the human story is much more important sometimes than the detail. And I think our society can get caught up in detail. Just a word about our organisation. We work a lot with corporates. We do a lot of work with law firms, and actually did a lot of work with the bar in the UK. But what's been very exciting in the last few years is we've started working with schools and universities. We work with over 30 schools, and we're working with a number of universities in the UK. And we've even just started working with a medical school, which has been a great joy. For reasons I think I hope I'm going to clarify for you. Just to explain, I'm a medic. I'm a doctor of medicine, as Mel mentioned. But I'm also a psychologist, but I wrote my thesis about 30 years ago on burnout in doctors. And the reason I did that is that, a bit like lawyers, doctors are a high-risk group. So doctors have a very high incidence of stress, anxiety, burnout, depression, substance abuse, but also suicide. And in the UK, the chances of a doctor taking their own life is 3 times higher than the normal population. In the US, it's 4 times higher. Now, what I think is interesting is that in medicine, you would think, well, you do, look for what are called risk factors and protective factors. So in things like diabetes, metabolic syndrome, heart disease, we look for the things that increase risk and the things that reduce risk. And if I asked you for the risk factors of heart disease, I think you'd probably get most of them. If I asked you for the protective factors in heart disease, I think you'd get most of them. I think what's interesting is that we don't do the same in psychological health. We know a lot of the risk factors in psychological health. We now know a lot of the protective factors, but that information is not in the public domain in the same way as it is around medical conditions. And medicine has moved upstream to try and protect people from becoming ill, which is a very good thing to do. It also gives people agency. If you know about smoking, exercise, diet, etc., it gives you the choice as to whether to do something or not to do it. I think we need to move upstream with psychological problems, because what we've done for the last 30, 40, 50 years is wait for people to get ill, and then we try and treat them and help them get better. And interestingly, the treatments we have are extraordinarily successful. They're difficult to access. I don't know how difficult they are here, but certainly in the UK, mental health has been massively underfunded. So it is, for every £1 spent on mental health in the UK, there's nearly £3 spent on cancer as part of a medical spend. That is extraordinary, and that's just one part of medical spending. It's been massively underfunded, particularly child and adolescent psychiatry or mental health services. So I think that needs to be rectified. Downstream services need to be rectified. But I want to talk to you today a bit about moving upstream and thinking about how we can prevent psychological problems. And there's very good data now coming through showing that we can at least impact on that trajectory. And rather, if you get people who have high risk for heart disease and you get them to change some of those risk factors, smoking, exercise, diet, you can actually change the trajectory of the illness. You can actually see the coronary arteries recanalize if people really change those risk factors. The same is definitely true for psychological problems. You can impact on them. And I think the sort of things we're going to be talking about today, I think we need to put into the water. We need to make them part of everybody's understanding. And I think that's going to have huge benefits in reducing the stigma, the shame, and the embarrassment around psychological problems. So I think that there's a bit of a backstory that I think we probably need to address. And the backstory is related to our society and how we deal with psychological problems. Because the term mental has very real connotations for a lot of people. It comes through your system 1, as Daniel Kahneman would call it. We have a bias, an unconscious bias. It has an association for us. And actually, for a lot of people, particularly men, as Peter very accurately alluded to, feeling psychologically distressed can become a source of distress. And we then become distressed about being distressed. And if you look at, I don't know what the data here in Australia is, but suicide is now the commonest cause of death in men under 50 in the UK. And most of those men have never spoken to anybody. They succeed often on their first attempt. And I think one of the reasons for that is stigma, shame, and embarrassment. People find it very difficult to talk about this about themselves, but they also find it difficult to talk to others. And I think that just serves to increase the problem. We're much better served by creating an understanding of psychological problems and creating emotional literacy. And that emotional literacy, I think, will reduce stigma, shame, and embarrassment. So I'm just going to start by talking a little bit about the incidence. Psychological well-being, basically, and again in the UK, we're seeing an increased incidence of psychological problems in young people. The incidence is growing, but it's also particularly increasing in women. And in fact, if you look at suicide in doctors, it's higher in women than it is in men. And I think one of the reasons for the increase is some of the things that nourish and deplete the human spirit. And I think Peter alluded to those very accurately in talking about the things that actually makes him feel happy and alive and connected, which we often leave to one side because we don't nourish ourselves with those in our modern society. I'd also suggest that psychological well-being sits on a continuum between feeling good, flourishing, languishing, and feeling unwell. And people who languish are often called presenteeism in the workplace. They're turning up for work, but they're feeling suboptimal. If you read the health economics around this, the health economics suggests that people who are languishing cost about 8 times the cost of people who are absent. Because people who are languishing have cognitive and behavioural impediments that actually stop them working as well as they might if they were feeling well. So this think, feel, behave is really important. Your cognitive function is absolutely correlated to your psychological well-being. Now, this is the work predominantly of Barbara Fredrickson in America, who's looked at cognitive function. And what she's shown is that when you feel well, you can access all areas of your brain. Your brain is online. But any decrement in your psychological well-being impacts your cognitive function. It's very easy to measure cognitive function. So these are things like concentration, memory, decision-making. And these are very essential for knowledge workers. But as you move along that continuum, they get impacted. And in fact, if you become unwell, if you develop a clinical depression, you can lose up to 70% of your cognitive function. And this is called psychomotor retardation in psychiatric speak. And in my age group, people often get diagnosed as having pseudo-dementia because they have such a powerful loss of cognitive function. The interesting thing is that when you treat the depression, the cognitive function comes back online. Depression is eminently treatable. And I think the problem is a lot of people don't access treatment, but it is eminently treatable. I think the second bit is the feel, the physiology. I don't want to go into great detail about this, but as a medic, I worked in psychological medicine, and this interaction between the mind and the body is incredibly intimate. Now, I was brought up in a dualistic model. We had separate hospitals for psychiatry, separate hospitals for medicine. In fact, your mental health has an absolute correlation to your physical health. In fact, there's a whole area of medicine, psychoneuroimmunology, psychoneuroendocrinology. It changes your immune function. In fact, if you get stressed or depressed, you increase inflammatory markers. If you develop clinical depression, that is a bigger risk factor for developing heart disease than smoking. That's because the inflammation furs up your arteries pretty quickly. And most depressive illnesses are associated with a degree of inflammatory activity in the body. And they strongly correlate also because they push up cortisol and various other hormones, but particularly cortisol, they increase the risk of metabolic syndrome, diabetes, heart disease, autoimmune disease. So this is a really important dynamic, and I think the danger is we separate the mind and the body. We need to reintegrate the mind and the body, and that may help the funding for mind-based activity. And the final thing is behaviour, and Peter again alluded to this very powerfully, how he was behaving, both at work but also at home, how he was ruminating about things. He was lost inside a system that was actually taking over most of his RAM and working memory. And that starts to impact on our relationships. And how we feel inside, we tend to push into the world. But what you push into the world impacts on the people around you, because we're social animals and we're designed to pick up how people are feeling. And we're particularly sensitive to how people we love are actually feeling. And watching somebody go through what Peter's just outlined is pretty tough on other people too. So I just wonder, is there anyone here who's never felt stressed or anxious? Good, okay, you're all normal, healthy human beings. I think this is really important because one of the things that is interesting about psychological health is that there's a big area of psychology looking at what's called metacognition. And I know that sounds a bit weird, but when people get stressed, sometimes what people will do is normalize it. They say, well, of course I'm stressed. So if it's a junior doctor or a lawyer saying, of course I'm stressed. I've been working really hard. I've been working long hours. I get woken up by the kids when I'm at home. Of course I'm knackered. And then they think, okay, well, what do I need to do to regain my equilibrium? Now, that is normalizing feeling stressed. One of the problems is that sometimes when people get stressed, and we saw this in doctors who tended to burn out, is that when they started to get stressed, they started to get stressed about being stressed. So they started to think, I shouldn't feel like this. I should be able to cope. Other people are coping. Why aren't I coping? I'm pathetic. I'm weak. I'm letting people down. That is a metacognitive process. It's the meaning that you attach to feeling distressed. And if you attach that meaning to feeling distressed, you pour petrol on the flames. You actually get worse much more quickly. There's a big area of psychology now called metacognitive therapy, getting people to change their relationship with feeling distressed. But I think that distress about feeling psychologically distressed is a socially constructed process. I think it links to our backstory. I think it links to how we talk about mental health anyway. And you can't even say the word mental health without people thinking about mental illness. This is a paper that was a really good paper published in The Lancet some years ago, but it looked at a large cohort, or two large cohorts of NHS consultants. Now, these are consultants working in our National Health Service. And I just want to draw your attention to this 2002 cohort. What they did is they found that of that group, 1,300 working, these are working NHS consultants, 32% had psychiatric morbidity. This is a caseness on the GHQ. So they had stress, anxiety, or depression. Now, you may say, well, poor old doctors. But actually, it's not just poor old doctors. This is a key performance indicator. This is a key quality indicator. Once you've recruited bright, competent, capable people, the best predictor for their performance is their psychological state, bar none. And what happened to the doctors, in this study, they compared the healthy doctors to the unhealthy doctors. And the unhealthy doctors had more patient complaints, massive increase in patient complaints. They had complaints from colleagues, but they also made more clinical errors, prescribing errors. They were also litigated much more frequently, and they were also lost to the profession more frequently. And they cost a lot to train, so this is a terrible waste. But it also impacts on patient care. So I think the danger is we see psychological well-being as something that happens to somebody. It actually happens to somebody and everybody they connect with, both professionally and at home. And this was a paper published. This caused quite a stir in the US because there was a lot of research looking at the addiction levels in young lawyers. And once again, you see these very high levels of depression, anxiety, and stress. And unfortunately, that is linked to risk, it's linked to error, it's linked to a whole range of variables that impact on reputation for law firms as well. So it's being taken very seriously, and it's also being taken seriously by our financial regulators in the UK. I just want to put this slide up because teaching professions, also nurses and health professionals, have a very high incidence of psychological problems. And one of the theories, and it's only one of the theories about this, is because if you care about people, then you tend to go the extra mile. You tend to work harder. And in fact, there's a woman called Maslach in America who wrote a book called Bound for Burnout, The Cost of Caring. People who care often can't boundary. And because they don't boundary, they think they have to rescue, save, and cure everybody, or they have to be perfect. And the danger with that is you only have a certain quantum of energy, and you can become exhausted. And I think Peter gave a very good outline of how easy it is when you have some perfectionistic traits and certain things happen in your world to find things pretty tough. And then you can start to attack yourself for not being able to cope, which is the metacognition, which can then just fuel the process even more powerfully. One of the reasons this matters a lot is that if you're a teacher and you're stressed, that impacts on the quality of teaching you deliver. And in fact, it's incredibly sensitive because if the teacher's stressed, then you measure the cortisol levels in saliva of their pupils, their students. The students become stressed when the teacher's stressed. So what we're doing is we're making other people stressed by teachers being stressed. And I think this is really important because acute stress doesn't seem to do you much harm. Chronic stress does you a lot of harm in lots of different ways. And we should be educating people about that. I put this slide up because it is a very distressing slide. This is called the Myriad study. It's a big epidemiological study looking at the incidence or prevalence of psychological problems in young people. And you see this peak in psychological problems between the age of 10 and 24, with about 13-14% of 16-year-olds will have a common mental health problem. That is normally anxiety and depression, but it could be eating disorder, it could be OCD, it could be all sorts of things, but the commonest are anxiety and depression. The difficulty with this, and one of the reasons, and I'll share with you why this is in a moment, but youngsters between about 10 and 24 feel emotions very, very much more potently than they will later in their life. And this emotional lability means that things stick. And they find things much more distressing. What is particularly concerning about this is that if you have a psychological problem between the age of 10 and 24, that accounts for 75% of all adult mental health problems. Now, this is hugely prognostic. It's telling you who's going to be ill in adulthood. And this is really concerning because this prevalence is increasing. And 75% of these people will go on to get mental health. That's actually, it's not true. 75% of people who have adult mental health problems will have had problems at this time. Now, why is that relevant? Because I think the quality of life, the cost to the nation, the cost to, in all sorts of different ways, but as Peter outlined, the costs to you personally, but to your family and to your friends is huge. And if we could modify or ameliorate that, now I don't think we should go utopian on this and think we can eradicate psychological problems. Actually, psychological problems are part of being human. And I'd like to emphasize that getting distressed, anxious, depressed is part of the human condition. The danger is getting stuck, and it is incredibly sticky. Most of us are going to feel anxiety. Most of us are going to have patches of depression. In fact, 1 in 4 of us are going to get a common mental health problem at some point in our lives. So we're either going to experience it or know someone very close or in our family or friendship circle who get it. But this is part of the human condition. I think moving into it is just part of life. I think what Peter's demonstrated is we need to be taught techniques to help us pull out of that space. And as he mentioned, I think this educative process should be part of the national curriculum. It should be in the water. It should be taught. It should be understood. Because we wait for people to get ill. And when we know, when people get ill, if they go through a treatment like cognitive behavioral therapy for anxiety, depression, panic disorder, OCD, PTSD, it's a better treatment than medication. But it also reduces relapse, so it's protective. But we wait for people to get ill before we give them the tools. Why don't we give them the tools before they get ill? Now, I'm not saying it will eradicate it, but it could definitely ameliorate it. And I think this is why there is an urgency to do that. I just want to flag this up, that we work at 3 different levels in organisations. We work at an individual level, a team level, and an organisational level. And the reason for that is that, to misquote John Donne, no man or woman is an island. We are deeply social animals. We're deeply connected, and we need other people. In fact, if you look at the research on loneliness, it is stonkingly bad for you. I mean, loneliness is really, really, really bad for you. It's worse than being a smoking diabetic in terms of early death. It is terribly bad for us. In fact, if you're a middle-aged man, 45 to 55, and you have no friends, no family, no partner, no social support, your life expectancy is 7 to 10 years less than a man who has a partner. And that's because it has an epigenetic effect. It switches on bad genes, and it actually is stonkingly bad for us. The converse is also true. Having good friends, family, social support is incredibly good for us. And I'll share some other thoughts about that in a minute. So this is a bit like individual, family, community. These things are hardwired into our system as social animals, particularly as hunter-gatherers. If these are supportive, we feel safe. We feel that we can relax. And that is a very important process. And what Peter touched on, I think, with the fact that he had support at home, from his wife and his friends and his family, but he had support at work. That was incredibly important in mitigating and helping him recover his equilibrium. And there is very, very good data on that. I just want to flag this up, just a bit of brain science, if you like. Emotions tend to be seated to a very large degree in the midbrain, and you can see this on fMRI scanning or PET scans. There's an area just behind your left eyebrow called your prefrontal cortex, which is very good at dampening down your emotional brain. Now we know that, and we've known that for decades, because if someone damages their prefrontal cortex because of a head injury, a tumour, a stroke, they lose the ability to control their emotions. And what's happening to those youngsters between 10 and 24 is, and if you've got children, there's a great TED talk by a woman called Sarah Jane Blakemore, who's a professor at UCL, professor of neuroscience, and she gives a very good outline of how the brain resculpts itself during adolescence, but it's also being impacted on by lots of different hormones. And all hormones are neurotransmitters. So you've got a brain that's sculpting itself in a different way, and the prefrontal cortex goes offline a bit. So that's why youngsters are less good at impulse control, and they're good on risk-taking. Partly because their prefrontal cortex isn't saying to them, I don't think that's a very good idea. So they have a go at it. But this dynamic is really important. And one of the things, has anyone heard of neuroplasticity? Well, when I went through medical school, we didn't know this, but you've got 100 billion neurons in your brain. Each neuron can have up to 10,000 connections, maybe more. And it's bathed in about 100 different chemicals that we know about. But what happens when you use your brain is you start to connect neurons up. And this was epitomized by a neurologist years ago who said neurons that fire together wire together. So the first study in the UK was done on black cab drivers, and they scanned their brain as they learnt the knowledge of London. So they spend 3 years learning the knowledge of London. And if you scan their brain sequentially over that period, you see billions of neurons connecting up in their hippocampus and their temporal lobe. And the reason for that is that they're recruiting neurons into their central GPS system. And then when you get in their cab 3 years later in Fleet Street and say, take me to Notting Hill, they map it in their head and they can take you on the route. But in order to do that, they've got to connect up neurons. When you learn the law, you connect up neurons. When you learn medicine, you connect up neurons. When you play the piano, you connect up neurons. And this is really, or hit a tennis ball, or drive a car. You have to connect up neurons. So whatever you use your brain for, you get better at it. So if you're a grumpy, miserable curmudgeon, and you do that every day, you get better and better at being grumpy and miserable and curmudgeonly. It's actually really important, because whatever you use your mind for, you will get better at. If you're angry, one of our colleagues at Positive has just published some papers on chronic embitterment syndrome. And chronic embitterment syndrome is when you think about the mischief or the injustice that's been done to you, you then ruminate about it. Now, I mean, I've done this myself. And the more you ruminate about it, the more you think about it. The more you think about it, the more you ruminate about it. But you actually wire up neurons. And you can see this on a brain scan, on serial fMRI scans. So it starts off as a footpath, and then it becomes a bridleway, and then a B road, then an A road, then an autobahn. And then it becomes your screensaver. And then when your eyes flutter open in the morning, you open them up and you think, you bastard, and off you go again. And it can make you very ill. And the problem is, if you take depression, what happens in depression is that depression is a very neuroplastic process. Because what you do is you attack yourself. You focus on, so if I saw someone clinically with depression, they often say things like, I failed, I've let people down, I'm not good enough, people will be better off without me, I'm worthless. But they do that time and time again, and that strengthens the circuit. And once you've had 3 episodes of clinical depression, and this is neuroplastic, your chances of relapse in any 18-month period is 80%. So we should be intervening very early to help people, because the longer you wait to help people, and that's why you should teach people these tools, how to break rumination. And Peter's using a range of tools that are helping him break that cycle. And if you change the cycle, I think what's very exciting is that you can see, if you take somebody through a course of cognitive behavioral therapy for panic disorder, OCD, depression, and you scan their brain sequentially, provided they practice the technique. Seeing the therapist doesn't do it. And Peter highlighted that beautifully, where he said he went and didn't do it, then he went and he did do it. If you go and you practice the techniques, you can see the fibres from the prefrontal cortex going down to the midbrain, to the amygdala, getting stronger and stronger and stronger. And that correlates with clinical improvement. So this is no longer warm, fluffy, tree-huggy stuff. This is hard data. This is scientific. And I think that's changing our understanding of this process. And I think it should also change our conversations about it and reduce the stigma and the shame. I just want to touch on this because this is what psychologists call a cognitive conceptualization. But it links to, and if I may, link to your story, Peter. I think the early experiences that Peter had developed some beliefs that he had. Now, when you're a child and something happens to you, you can become very distressed by it. But then it changes how you think about yourself. So you start to change how you think about you. So when something goes wrong, if you get left out of the group, if you're excluded by people, or as with Peter, he has an accident that then changes his way he sees himself, that encodes, because emotion encodes data onto your hard disk. There's nothing better than emotion for encoding onto your hard disk. And if they did a study in America where they asked people 3 years after 9/11 where they were when, this was 3,000 people, where were you when you saw the planes fly into the Twin Towers? What percentage of people do you think could remember where they were? 100%. Well, it's actually 95, but very close to 100%. And why do you think they can remember? It's a shock. Absolutely. And interestingly, if I got you to write your timeline, most of the things you'd write about would be things that had emotion attached to them. If you ask someone where they were on February the 3rd, 2010, most people say, I haven't a bloody clue. I did it with a group the other day, and a woman put her hand up and said, I know exactly where I was. She said, I was just going in for a hysterectomy. But this is irrelevant because it was emotionally relevant. She was worried about her surgery. It was a big deal. So we encode things, and then they can start to inform how we think about ourselves. And how we think about ourselves, we can then carry for decades. And the imposter syndrome is a great example. If you're left out and you think, people think I'm weird, I don't fit in, people don't like me, that can form a core belief. And then later in life, that can start to inform whether you socialise, whether you stand up and do stuff. And this links to Henry Ford's line, which was, if you think you can or you think you can't, you're probably right. This is a very worrying legacy of these conditioned beliefs. And Malcolm Gladwell talked about this. In fact, in Australia, am I right in thinking your academic year starts in January? Yeah. Well, you have a disproportionate number of people who go into professional sport who are born in Q1. Does anyone know why that might be? Absolutely, but they also have better hand-eye coordination because your hand-eye coordination improves chronologically. So what happens is the kids go down and the coach throws the ball to the year group. The kid in Q1 catches the ball and throws it back to the coach. The coach says, hey, you're good, I like you, you're in my team. Two things happen in terms of forming a core belief. The child thinks, hey, I'm okay. And other people think I'm okay. So now how I'm seen in the eyes of others is encoding onto his hard disk. The kid in Q4 is more likely to go, oh damn, drop the ball, and his mates laugh at him, and the coach says, whoa, I think you need some practice. He feels embarrassed and ashamed. 2 days later, somebody says, I'm going to go and throw a ball around. The kid who caught the ball says, I'll come and do that. I love it. The kid who dropped the ball says, no, I think I'm going to have a fag behind the pavilion. I don't do that stuff. Do you see what's happening neuroplastically as the kid who catches the ball gets good at catching it? The kid who dropped the ball might be a better ball player than the kid who caught the ball. And these self-limiting beliefs can sit on your hard disk for decades and inform what you can and can't do. And most of us, I mean, if we had time, we'd do this with you. If I asked you to write down something that you can do, you jot down a few things, and if someone says, could you do this? Yeah, no problem. But if I asked you to write down a couple of things that you can't do, you'd say, oh, I don't like doing that. But a lot of this formulates because of our past experiences. And that's a real danger because it can start to pollute your ability to fulfill your potential. And it can also make you feel that you're not good enough. So, I just wanted to talk about imagination very briefly. I think that this, is the really interesting connection between why human beings are the only primate that get clinically depressed, but certainly the only primate that takes their own life. And that's partly because what you use your mind for affects how you feel. So if you imagine something, you activate 80% of the neurons that you would activate if that thing happened. And this is called functional equivalence. So if I'm lying at home, and I'm in bed on my own and at night, and I hear a noise in the night, and I think to myself, that's my Labrador, and I do have a Labrador, so it's not a deluded thought. If I think it's my Labrador, that actually activates quite an interesting neural circuit in my brain, because I love my Labrador, so I produce a little dopamine, a bit of oxytocin, a bit of serotonin, I feel good, I pull up the duvet and go back to sleep. But if I hear the same noise because I'd watched Psycho before I went to bed, or I'd met someone in the pub who told me there'd been a break-in down the road, I hear the same noise and I think there's an intruder in the house, that thought or image will activate my threat circuit. And I've now got a thumping heart, dry mouth, sweaty palms, and I'm wired to the moon. I do not pull up the duvet and go back to sleep. I cannot take my attention away from the sound downstairs. Now this is really important, and this is why Milton, 400 years ago, wrote in Paradise Lost, "The mind can make a heaven of hell or a hell of heaven." We need to be very careful what we use our mind for. Now we all get into these patterns of worry and rumination, or most of us do. But we need to teach people techniques for breaking out of worry and rumination. Because if you stay in it for long enough, as Peter outlined, it can make you feel absolutely wretched. I think in terms of lawyers and expert professionals, they often have a level of perfectionism, and perfectionism in a scholastic or even a university career is often lauded. So we like people who do well, and it can be increased by tiger parents, who when you come back with 98%, they say, well, what happened to the other 2%? It can be increased by the institution or the organisation you work in. But some of us do it to ourselves. And the problem is that if you are a very powerfully unhealthy perfectionist, then you're very binary in your thinking. And you have a little rule on your hard disk that says, if I do X, Y, and Z really, really well, / perfectly, then I'm okay. But if I don't do X, Y, and Z really, really well, / perfectly, then I'm worthless. I'm a failure. It's very binary, it's very dichotomous. I'm either okay or I'm worthless. This is a very dangerous cognitive style, and it's associated with becoming psychologically distressed. Healthy perfectionism is different. You strive to be the best you can be. But when something goes wrong, you don't attach your ego and your self-worth to it. You're disappointed, frustrated, irritated, but you let go of it and get back on the horse. And this links to an area that's being developed in schools in America. It's being done in the UK. Schools using the growth mindset here. Well, the growth mindset basically looks at cognitive flexibility. The fixed mindset is binary. And it tends to make people, they want to look clever all the time. And if you want to be clever all the time, you can start to procrastinate or avoid challenges because you don't want to appear stupid. In fact, Carol Dweck encourages parents not to tell your children they're clever, because if you tell them they're clever, they're more likely to develop this binary way of thinking. If I do well, mummy, daddy, teachers will think I'm okay. And the problem with this is that they feel threatened by failure or criticism. Whereas the growth mindset, and this is fascinating, this is Angela Duckworth's work from the US, showing that perseverance is a better predictor for success in life than IQ or parental socioeconomic group. So this is what we should be doing, but we should be rewarding people for effort and not for being clever. And I think some of our scholastic patterns and some of the pressure, I don't know what's happening here, but we're having huge pressure on our schools to produce more higher grades and get more people into university. And that seems to be how we judge people. And I think that's more prose than poetry. So just a tool that I think is really important, and I think Peter again exemplified, is how you talk to yourself. Now, if we had time, we'd go into this in much more detail, but out of interest, how many of you have had a good teacher in your life? Hands up, who's had a good teacher? And what are the adjectives that you'd use to describe a good teacher? Supportive? Sorry? Affirming, yeah. Inspiring, interested. Patient. What sort of impact does that have on a youngster or even an adult? What impact does it have on their confidence or self-esteem or willingness? It builds it. How many of you have had a bad teacher? What I'd like you to do over the next couple of weeks is just shine the torch on how you talk to yourself. And the reason this is important, how you talk to yourself is actually correlated to your psychological health and well-being. And people who are very self-critical, self-recriminating tend to develop more psychological problems. It's no different to if you have a bad teacher. You're less likely to do well. If you have a good teacher, they will get the best from you. They support you, they encourage you. They stretch you, but they also are on your side. And you have between 30 and 70,000 thoughts a day. Now, interestingly, most of them you won't bring into awareness, and rather upsettingly, most of them are the same as you had yesterday. So what I would encourage you to do is, if you are self-critical, self-recriminating, self-deprecating, is to develop a good teacher in your head, to develop an inner coach. But in order to do that, you have to shine the torch on how you're talking to yourself. And I think what we know is that people who switch their pattern of self-talk change the neural circuits in their brain. You can see that on serial fMRI scans. This is a basic cognitive technique used in cognitive behavioral therapy, highly effective. But why aren't we teaching our youngsters this at a scholastic level? So I'd encourage you to use the inner coach. And then just on social support, Peter touched on this. I think this is absolutely critical, because actually how you feel you push into the world, but it also impacts on other people. And when we're distressed, having social support and people around us is incredibly protective. There's just been a big study done in the US on soldiers who develop post-traumatic stress disorder. And what they've shown is that the social cohesion and support in the army unit is the best protection against developing PTSD. And this is actually across every age, from the cradle to the grave. The level of social support we have is highly protective to our own mental health. The World Health Organization looked at this in every country in the world. Social support is correlated to a whole fantastic range of outcomes. There are blue zones. If you Google blue zones, there are areas in the world where people live into their 90s or early 100 and something. It doesn't correlate very well with material wealth. It correlates incredibly well with social support, purpose, meaning, and a sense of connection, of being part of a group, part of a community. And I don't think these are particularly radical thoughts, but I think we're losing sight of the things that nourish the human spirit. And this is one that definitely nourishes the human spirit. And the ratio of positive statements to negative statements, both how you talk to yourself, but how you talk to one another. Martin Seligman just published a paper which is quite extraordinary. He managed to persuade Twitter to share all the tweets. Now, this isn't Cambridge Analytica, but what he did was he fed the data. He divided how people talk to each other into loving, supportive, friendly, benign, rude, toxic, and abusive. He fed the data into an analysis package and then put it onto the US map. How people talk to each other was a better predictor for early death from heart disease than smoking. The quality of our conversations, the quality of your relationships is incredibly potent at predicting not only your enjoyment of life, but also, interestingly, whether you get ill and whether you perish. So I think, just to finish, I think there are things that happen in the organisation, and Chief Justice mentioned this concept of values. I think it's absolutely relevant, and this is to do with trust. And what's been shown, these are all neurobiological drivers. If you're in a group of people who have a clear sense of purpose and meaning, if you're in a group of people, whatever the hierarchy, that respect each other, whatever level you are in the organisation, if you feel included, if you feel you have a sense of autonomy, if you feel things are fair, and there's a degree of certainty, and sometimes it's up to the leadership to create that sense of certainty and direction, and you feel stretched rather than stagnant, it has a huge impact on performance. I think this is fascinating work out of the US, looking at, if you work alone for more than 2 days a week, you start to actually run out of ideas. We need other people. It creates what's sometimes called a creative abrasion, and people bounce ideas off. You get a really good flow when you're working with other people. And this is sort of adaptive social learning. The danger is that that group then becomes stagnant and they don't challenge each other, and this creates a sort of echo chamber or groupthink. So I think that these areas of changing ideas is really powerful. And I think it's perfectly possible to introduce psychological and emotional literacy into the workplace. I really don't think that's a particularly complicated process, but I think it has to come from senior endorsement, because what we found, particularly with law firms, is if the leadership say, this is a really good idea, we absolutely get it, we buy it, but they don't do it, it makes very little difference. If the senior leadership buy it and do it, it has a huge impact. It starts to become what we do around here. And I think I just highlight this difference between individual learning. If you tell somebody something that is genuinely helpful, such as smoking is bad for you or exercise is good for you, about 15% of people will change their behaviour. And they're sometimes called early adopters. They think, okay, I'll go and do that, I'll go and change that. But if you use social learning, where the group starts to change, this is what we're going to do around here. Actually, we're going to change this. It becomes like a group charter. If the culture changes, that's 4 to 5 times more powerful than individuals trying to change. So I think the way to change these things is for people to put their heads together and say, this is important, and we're going to do it, and this is how we're going to do it, and then you have to keep practicing it. And as Peter said, you've got to keep doing this, because if you stop going to the gym, you lose your fitness. If you keep doing this stuff, it makes a huge difference, and it's neuroplastic and it's epigenetic. So I'll just finish with this slide, because I think that if we can humanize organizations, and I think this links to emotional literacy. Emotional literacy is really, really powerful, because I think it will reduce stigma, shame, and embarrassment. I think there's a sign actually up in Edgecliff that I saw the other day where it says, literacy is freedom. Have people seen that sign? I would actually say emotional literacy is liberating, because it normalizes, it helps people understand what the risk factors are and the protective factors are. And I think it links to recovery. There was an interesting medical sociologist called Zola, who did some fascinating work, and he's sadly dead now, but he wrote about a man going for a walk in the woods, and he comes through the woods and out into a clearing, and there's a stream, and he walks down the stream on a nice sunny day, and he sees a man in the distance, and he becomes intrigued by this man because he seems to be pulling bodies out of the water. So he goes up to this man, he says, what are you doing? And this guy says, well, I'm pulling these guys out of the water and I'm resuscitating them. He says, that's fantastic. And he says, yeah, I'm a doctor. And he said, the trouble is I'm so busy pulling them out of the water, I haven't got time to go upstream to see who's pushing them in. Now, I think we need to move upstream. We need to improve our downstream, but we also need to move upstream. And I think you can put things in the water that would actually, if someone does fall in, they get out of the water quicker. And I don't think these are particularly complicated. They are not rocket science. And I think they need to be distributed out into the world, and I think that could make a powerful difference. And I think it needs that senior endorsement, and it needs a cultural shift, but I think that's feasible, and I think it's great to hear that our youngsters are getting this, and we're certainly doing it with some schools and universities in the UK. So I think there is room for optimism, as Peter said, and I'm going to stop on that point.